one of the reasons I sort of made the connections to the claims of how Trump will adjudicate his whole approach to deporting migrants was a claim I read somewhere from a policy advisor that the idea would be to put people in camps because if they're forced to go through their applications while staying in camps rather than in wider American society, if they think they're going to be around for years but not integrated in society but stuck in the camp, they might just choose to leave instead because of how complex that is. And again, it really jumped out to me as a classic, like, let's use the process and executive action as punishment because, even if that person ultimately is permitted to stay in the US or regularized, we've basically punished them and made it just harder for them to be here in the first place. And it really and I can see that touching a chord with evidently some sections of the population at large.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the threat of punishment is obviously the point here. And when we say the population at large, I don't know, I don't want to get too Pollyannish about this, but one of the truly depressing things coming out of the election was reading stories about people who had undocumented members in their own families who said, well, they haven't committed any crimes, so it won't affect them, which the crime is being in the country, so yes, they have. Or alternatively, like, who decided that was a gamble worth taking, right? Which is sort of neither here nor there. But I think you're right to say, like, well, the system moves too slowly and the system's broken and nobody's fixing it. And so we're just going to put them in camps, or we're just going to separate them from their families, or we're just going to et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this sort of, I actually think it will be, like, please don't misunderstand me. I think it will be, however they decide to do this is going to be painful and messy. There are people who were separated from their parents in Trump 1. Those families have still not been reunited, right? And by the way, 1 in 15 families, I think the statistic is, has people in their family here in the United States who are undocumented. So this is going to touch a range of people and whole swaths of society. But I think... So I actually don't think that in practice, but having said all that, I don't think that in practice it would be like, yeah, we're just going to do this. Like, I don't know that they've thought through all of the actual practical steps involved, and that it won't be as easy as, like, here we go, detention centers. But yeah, it's threat of powerful, punitive executive action, and that has some real appeal for some people.
And with the relative lack of court oversight, or rather, there is absolutely court oversight in the United States because that's how it works, but because that's so politicized, that nothing gets stopped.
I mean, this is why I asked about attacking the courts in India, because in the US, it's quite interesting, in that courts absolutely will be attacked if they rule against any of this by Trump at the political project. But what's interesting to me is that, in fact, like, there's a conservative legal project in this country that has for years worked to stack courts of all different levels with sympathetic judges, including on this issue, right? Like, so, we could go on and on about the Supreme Court, but it's not just the Supreme Court, right? It's courts across the land. And so this is the other thing about due process. It's like, yeah, we do, like, yes, you have it. Yes, there's court oversight. Yes. But so much depends on where the trial is held, who the judge is, who put them on the bench. That's not how it's supposed to be. But the reality is that often that is indeed what happens.
We don't have your system in India. We have a judicial appointment system that's supposedly apolitical and supposed to be sort of cushioned against political interference. And this is occasionally disputed, by folks who think that it ought to be, they ought to be more answerable. But I'll just point out that despite all of that, the Supreme Court's decision comes years after these petitions turned up. And conspicuously, of course, in a year that Modi's had a bit of a political setback. It didn't come in the years when it seemed he was flying high. So there's layers. It's complex, and it's hard to argue one way or the other because of a little more how opaque the Indian judicial system is on this front. But that there is political consideration at play is inevitable. And regardless, just again, to speak exactly to this point, just the choice of delaying when to respond on a case alone can be a political action.